Joining me today is Dr. Luis Davinia. He's a political scientist who has worked as a public employee in Portugal. He's also been involved in party politics there too. These days, he studies how politics influence foreign policy decision making. He's going to help us understand how politics are part of the fabric of everyday life. So, Luis, before we get started, I know you're from New Jersey. How does it feel to be from a place that's not New York?
I'm actually pretty proud to be from New Jersey. If you've ever seen the Jersey Shore, you've seen that anyone would be proud to belong to that, a community of well-educated, respectful, and a hardworking group of individuals. So yeah, I'm quite happy being from New Jersey and not New York.
So I know politics is something that people debate all the time in their everyday lives. Everyone has a position. They like to talk about politics this, politics that. But actually, politics is everything, isn't it?
Yes, I would say we do tend to talk about politics as big picture things, politics with capital P. But if we think about it, politics does influence almost everything we do in our daily lives. Let me give you an example of my life, how politics affects sometimes the most minute things. For example, I woke up this morning and I heard the garbage truck coming and picking up the bins, right? Because it's trash day. So if you think about it, these things are regulated by political institutions that are run by political decision makers.
What,
And if
what
you
kind of regulations with trash are there? I mean, it's
well,
trash.
it's
Don't you just
trash.
throw it away?
It's trash, but ultimately, what gets thrown where, what gets separated, the recycling, what time, what days you put, all of that is regulated by political institutions. It's not, you can't just put the bin out on, at least on my street on Wednesday, right? You'd probably get fined.
And we've also seen a big change in terms of how trash is, right? Because when you and I were kids, there was no recycling bin, there was no green waste bin, right? Like that was just not part of how you threw things away. You put everything in the same bin and it was picked up. Now you actually can't do that.
Yes, definitely. When I grew up, you could just toss it out into the street pretty much. I'm from New Jersey, right? So we would just toss it out into the street. And you're right. This is environmental issues have really made it to the forefront of the political agenda. So today we're much more judicious in the way that we deal with our waste. So you're exactly right. Again, political actors now regulate this sort of activity, and we're much more conscious of what we do with our waste.
Okay, so what else? What else in society is
So
regulated?
I'm waking up. The first thing I do then is usually turn on the light. And if you think about it, the electricity that I'm getting is highly regulated. It's either provided directly by a public institution or it's probably outsourced to a private company, but regulated. Once again, environmental concerns are probably involved there. Then I'm going to go I'll have my cereals. The amount of sugar in the milk is going to be regulated by government agencies. Then I'll have my toast. The amount of salt that we have in bread is regulated by political institutions. And then if you think about it, I usually take a shower after that. The water, who's providing the water? The amount of content, chemicals, and other elements that can be present in the water are regulated by political actors. Then I'll usually take the bus or the car here to the university. The roads, how fast, the speed limit is defined.
And I don't
Again,
understand how this is not a bigger political issue because traffic here moves like molasses, right? Like, I mean, can we get a few New Jersey politicians coming in here and changing the speed limit so
right.
we can actually drive at a reasonable speed?
I would think so. 60 miles an hour I don't think is that
60
much.
miles an hour? You're joking. It's 60K. That's like 40 miles an hour.
Oh, it's kilometers. Then that would explain some tickets that I have. But anyways, with that said, then I get to the university. And if you think about it, the university, especially for students' educational experience is highly regulated by it is governmental institutions or political institutions that say how many credits a degree it will have, what the fees are, what accreditation is necessary to. So a student's educational experience, like our educational experience, highly regulated and determined by political institutions. Then I'll leave, and if we go to a coffee shop or a supermarket, what time they can open, what time they can close, what they can they sell alcohol or not, etc. All of these things, again, are usually determined and regulated by political institutions.
And we see that they vary a lot, right? Because here in this state, if you want to buy alcohol, you have got to go to the liquor store
Yes.
just to get things like beer, wine, anything. You can't buy it at the grocery store. But, in most places in the United States and other states here in Australia, you can often go to a grocery store and you can buy, your booze.
Yes.
So we see that, there's a lot of local differences and a lot of different people who are making decisions that are not necessarily high level national, international actors, right?
Yeah, usually it's the bureaucracy, the public bureaucracy. When I was in public administration in Portugal, I was not a top decision maker, but I would be, providing them with suggestions. In the case, I used to work in planning and development, and I would be saying, here, we should implement these regulations or these measures because I think they're a good idea. Hopefully based on solid evidence, but probably wasn't always the case. But then again, I go home, maybe I want to have a party. There's probably going to be a local or state ordinance, probably a local ordinance on, how loud the music can be. There's going to be certain decibels that you can't surpass.
Yeah,
They'll
that's
tell
funny.
you what time you have to turn that down, right?
Well, it's funny you should say that, right? Because when I was an undergraduate in New Orleans, you had to call a police officer if you want to throw a party at the frat house, right? And the cops would park out in front of the house, and they would just sit there. And I suppose they were there if something went haywire. But there was a certain time, I think 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, where they had to cut the party off. And, the cop came and knocked on the door and said, the party's over. And then you had to cut everything off. All the booze had to move inside the house. No more music, nothing. And the party was disbanded. It was really quite something. But, I've never lived anywhere else where that was the case. I've also never lived anywhere else where you can drink liquor in an open container on the sidewalk. God, I miss New Orleans.
Yeah. In most of the U.S., for example, growing up in New Jersey, if you were taking liquor out of a liquor store or a bar, it would have to go in a container or a paper bag or something. Again, because political institutions and political decision makers, deem that is.
So you're
that is
telling me the
worthy.
paper bag is inherently a political issue?
The paper bag, it was a political issue because you would get fined if you were caught with open and exposed, beer bottle or any kind of alcohol. At least when I was growing up in the 80s. And I know this is true because my dad owned a bar, so I was quite aware of the law at the time. But also in other miscellaneous things, if you think about it, political institutions and political actors will determine, for example, how old you have to be to quit school. The mandatory number of years you have to go to school or complete. If you think about it, how old you are to drink, how old you have to be to drive, how old you have to be to vote, how old you have to be to rent a hotel room. Ultimately, how old you have to have sex with someone legally. So if you think about it, the politics with the small p really permeates our day to day. So, politics, as you said, is everything.
A lot of folks like to think about crime as a black and white issue, something which is definitive. It's either right or it's wrong. But you study international relations, you study foreign policy, and the questions of right and wrong are certainly inherent to the things that you study. How does this come about? Who determines what right and wrong is, and how does that change over time?
Yeah. In foreign policy and international relations more generally, I'm just going to go back 100 years. What's considered right in international relations today, is very different than what was considered right 100 years ago. If you think about it, let me give you an example. In the early 20th century was when we had the first attempts to outlaw war because it was accepted that countries could take what they wanted by force. Today, we have a whole host of international institutions that deem that's not acceptable. There's a whole host of human rights or international human rights regime that sort of says every individual, regardless, of their gender, regardless of their age, their religion, their, political affiliation, et cetera, has certain rights. Just as a human being, 90 years ago, that was something that didn't exist. So, what's acceptable today is very different than what was acceptable or considered correct in the past. I think that's just normal. And really, if you think about it, you said who determines this? I would say, obviously, they're in the international relations field or in international politics, it's usually states. And when I say states, I usually mean the nation state. as the key player, but also international institutions. And then in my field of study, because theory is very important in this, we'll see that some theorists, mainly in what's called the realist camp, will say it's those states that are more powerful are capable of imposing certain rules and enforcing them. But then we'll see, for example, liberal scholars and others saying, no, some of these institutions are also really important in developing these rules and disseminating these rules. And what's really interesting, I think, over the last 60 to 70 years is the role that these institutions have played in allowing sometimes smaller actors, smaller states, non-state actors such as NGOs and other sorts of organizations to come in to the decision-making sphere to sort of generate a collective decision-making, or as good as it's going to get, understanding how international politics works. So yes, I think things really vary. Even democracy. What we consider democracy in Australia or the United States or Europe is quite different than how democracy is interpreted in other places. For example, just at the end of last year, China published a document on how they define democracy.
That was 2021.
2021, but their conception of democracy is quite different than ours. Is one right or the other one wrong? No, it's just different interpretations. Obviously, in this case, I think there's some political objectives there. But this just to say, one of the things you learn, especially in political science, and I think in social sciences in general, is there's really no absolute truths and definitive truths, at least.
Well, maybe I can push back because it seems like those who have a lot of power are the ones who are most able to make the rules and do the things that they want to do.
Yes, that would be true. I would say, though, it depends on regime. On regime types. I think one of the interesting features, if you want, or dynamics of the last, I'm going to say the last century, is we've seen in liberal democracies an attempt to broaden the capacity or the space for individuals to participate in the political process and the decision-making process. And especially today, where especially societies such as, in our case, the U.S., or in Europe or in Australia, societies are changing. They're more diverse. And there's this acknowledgement that, all of the actors have to be able to participate and pursue their interests, within an open political process. Other regimes will see that that's not the case. The only small group, usually, of very powerful individuals or elites are capable of really defining politics and defining the political agenda. I would add, though, that even in societies such as ours, there's a lot of research that does show that even though everyone has theoretical access to the political process, we do know that there are certain asymmetries. We do know that research, in the case of the United States, shows that individuals who are wealthier, corporations, big corporations, do have a bigger role in the political decision making, an oversized influence in the political process. I think that has a lot to do also with institutional factors. But in theory, what we'll see is in societies like ours, there's an attempt to include a number of individuals within the decision-making process, which I think is a sign of a healthy democracy.
Okay. One of the things that I think we've noticed in our lifetimes is how society changes and what is considered to be right and wrong, or the appropriate rules in order to govern a situation have changed quite a lot. In our lifetimes, I think smoking is one of the best examples of that, right? Certainly, culturally, smoking has been a thing which has been very different in the places that we've lived, right? Certainly in Europe, smoking was far more acceptable up until more recently compared to the United States, and certainly compared to here. We see this with all sorts of changes in terms of how cigarettes are taxed. We also see it in terms of who is contributing to the discussion and making the rules in terms of smoking. So how does this actually work in terms of politics, right? Is this really a political thing, or are we seeing that politics gets parked to public health? What's going on?
Listen, I grew up in the 1970s and 1980s. And I was a smoker for many years. And when I was smoking, in the late 1980s, very young, I knew what the health risks were. The Marlboro Man was on TV, and, Marlboro had advertisement in Formula One and all these things. But we knew, I think the studies were out there. But really, political decision makers in the case of the United States were reluctant to regulate it or place greater restrictions on access to
Why
cigarettes.
was that?
Probably because at the time, opposition to cigarettes, and I'm going to call it that for lack of a better name, was not as involved as they have been over the years. The capacity to influence decision makers, more groups being able to be involved in the political process. You know, one of the things I do admire in the United States, I don't know in Australia, it was certainly not like this when I was in Europe, was it's quite easy for me to pick up, I used to live in North Dakota, even though I'm originally from New Jersey, pick up the phone and talk to my senator or my representative. Usually if you pick up the phone, it's not going to be the senator, but for example, I had contact with Heidi Heitkamp's office back in the day because I needed something and they solved it. So I think that wouldn't have happened, or it would have been more difficult 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I do think today also there's a greater openness to all of these actors participating. And I do think in the case of cigarettes, groups associated with public health, with children's health, anti-tobacco lobby, if you want, has found a way to participate and to sway politicians. And you're right, when I arrived in Europe in 1993, and for many years, I would smoke in the university, I would smoke in my office at work, only somewhere, I'm going to say in the early 2000s, was it prohibited in public
Yeah,
in
and
public
I
settings.
remember that because there was a debate there, even though there was the public health issue. The counterpoint was that it was going to be bad for business. People weren't going to show up to the bar. They weren't going to spend their money. They weren't going to be as happy when they go out. And that turned into a pretty politically charged issue. You know, I think there were referendums in some cases. But at the end of the day, we see that in most European countries, smoking is now prohibited in bars and clubs, just like it is here in Australia. And we've seen that higher taxes have been implemented in order to diminish the appeal to younger people by increasing the cost of cigarettes, right?
I do think and in Europe, I remember at the time, like I was still a smoker at the time, it was people being more involved in the political process and being more active in fighting for what they believe is right. And ultimately, we've already mentioned it, there is an asymmetry of power with access to the political process. But if you do get enough people on board, if you do get enough groups on board, you can ultimately have a fighting chance of changing legislation. And I think in the case of cigarettes, that was quite successful against the tobacco companies and other entrenched interests at the time.
I think one of the other things that's really important is just how politicized rulemaking in terms of the carceral system is, criminal justice system is, right? Because we've seen big changes in our lifetimes. You know, I think of things like interracial marriage, right? That was something that impacted my parents. When my parents were born, interracial marriage was illegal. In fact, a white person could not marry a black person. That only changed in the 1950s in the United States, if I'm not mistaken. Those regulations were here in Australia too, where Aboriginal people didn't necessarily have the right to marry who they wanted, particularly if they're marrying outside of their communities. And so we see that that was a time where rules were very, very different compared to the norms that we accept today. And we see many different examples. Abortion, we see examples like drug use even. We see examples like
Gender,
gay marriage, right? We have all of these rules that have changed as a part of political pressure, political process. But there's still a lot of people who are effectively excluded from the political process. You know, certainly when we think of criminal justice, particularly in the United States, once somebody has a felony conviction, in many states, they can, even after they serve their sentences, they can never regain
voting.
their right to vote. Exactly. And so they can never regain the capacity to be full-blown citizens.
Yeah.
So when we start thinking about the politics of this, what are the types of things that we need to consider?
Reading some stuff and having at the time in the United States to every once in a while interact with my colleagues who were working in criminology. For example, African American population is about 12 to 13%, I think, of the overall population, but it's completely represented on the other end of the spectrum in terms of incarceration, right? Same thing with Latinos, etc. So you're exactly right. I do think the first thing is understanding that there are structural issues there, right? It's been shown a couple of studies when I used to teach American government, and I would talk about some of these issues. I would show like the if you could have two individuals born same building, same street, same building, one white, the other one black, go to the same school, have the same upbringing, the probability that the white student would have a more successful life, economic life, etc., was significantly higher than the black individual, right? So there's some structural issues there, and we're generalizing obviously because we look at large statistical numbers. But I think you're right. But I do think there has been this recognition in large part of the society. I think what happens a lot of times is society moves forward and accepts things before political institutions. If we know anything about institutions, is they're bureaucratic in nature, and bureaucracies tend to be very resistant to change. So I do think a lot of times society has moved on, accepts certain things, has certain views, considers certain things correct, other things incorrect. But it's harder to move political institutions just because there are certain interests that are highly entrenched that become a little bit more difficult. The payoff sometimes for them it isn't worth changing. I think we have moved forward, and you're exactly right. I have seen transformations in the United States and Europe, especially in all the issues you spoke about and some others, that we've made more change maybe in 50 to 60 years than we probably did for quite a few centuries. Are we at a point where I think most of us are satisfied? I would say no, right? But I do think one of the things we do have, and I'm always happy when I say I've lived in the United States, I've lived in Europe, I live in Australia, I've always lived in societies where there is access to the political process, right? Again, there's asymmetries, but I feel comfortable that if I need to take a position, speak to my local representative or my state representative, or ultimately write a letter to my national representative, that I can have a voice and I can organize with people who share common values and interests and try to change the political process. No guarantees that I'll be successful at all, but at least I have that capacity. Whereas there's a larger part of the world population that cannot say the same thing, right? So their space for improvement is still much greater.
And there are certainly populations within the communities that we've lived in that are systematically excluded
Definitely.
from those political processes. You mentioned African American people in the United States. I mean, the incarceration rates of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Australia are shameful, right? They're the singularly most incarcerated population in the Western world. So I think this is a problem that we have to be aware of, that we have to understand that it has, like you said, structural impacts, and that influences the way that life unfolds. At the end of the day, politics isn't everything that we see, and how it influences us is something that we have to be quite aware of, whether we're talking about international relations, foreign policy, or they're talking about domestic politics and the carceral system. Louis, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
Sir, always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.